They kept calling, and every ring echoed a version of the past that no longer had permission to reach you. The screen would light up, the name would appear, and for a moment the world would pause, not because you were tempted, but because memory is stubborn. Memory likes to test, resolve. Still, you didn't answer. Not out of spite, not out of cruelty, but because answering would have meant reopening a door you closed to save yourself. They kept apologizing, sending messages layered with regret, explanations wrapped in remorse, promises stitched together with urgency. You read none of it the way they hoped you would. You didn't dissect it. You didn't debate its sincerity. You didn't weigh whether it was enough. You simply didn't acknowledge it. Silence became your boundary, and boundaries don't need justification. For a long time, you were the one who picked up. You were the one who answered, even when it hurt. You were the one who listened through the cracks, who tried to understand the unexplainable, who gave benefit after benefit of doubt. You trained yourself to be available, reliable, forgiving, and in that training you learned something the hard way. Availability without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. So when the calls kept coming, you recognized them for what they were. Not urgency born of accountability, but panic born of consequence. They weren't calling because they suddenly understood your pain. They were calling because they finally felt it, and that difference matters. You didn't owe them a response just because they were uncomfortable. The phone rang at inconvenient hours, as if timing could recreate intimacy. Late nights, early mornings, moments when the world was quiet enough for guilt to get loud. They hoped to catch you when you were tired, when nostalgia might soften you, when loneliness might make you mistake familiarity for safety. But you didn't pick up because you finally learned that peace is fragile and not everyone deserves access to it. They left voicemails filled with emotion, voices trembling, words breaking, stories rewritten to sound gentler than they were when they happened. You didn't listen to them the way they wanted. You didn't let their tone dictate your truth. You understood something they didn't. Apologies don't erase patterns, and regret doesn't reverse damage. Acknowledgement is not automatic. It's earned, and they spent too long spending your grace without replenishing it. They kept saying they were sorry, but sorry came late. Sorry came after the consequences. Sorry came when silence replaced certainty. Sorry came when you stopped explaining. And by then, the window for acknowledgement had already closed, not slammed shut, just quietly sealed. You didn't announce your decision. You didn't send a final message. You didn't demand closure. You simply stopped participating. And that absence was louder than any confrontation could have been. They didn't know how to process that kind of ending. They were used to reactions, used to tears, anger, discussions, negotiations, used to emotional labor from you. Silence stripped them of control. Silence didn't argue. Silence didn't bargain. Silence didn't care how convincing their apology sounded. Silence just meant it was over. They told themselves you were being cold, that you were being dramatic, that you were punishing them. They needed those narratives to survive the truth that you were choosing yourself without theatrics, that you weren't trying to hurt them, that you were simply done. They kept calling because calling meant hope, and hope kept them from facing the finality they caused. Each unanswered ring forced them closer to accountability. Each ignored message confronted them with the reality that access isn't guaranteed forever. You remembered all the times you called and they didn't pick up, all the times you tried to explain and got dismissed, all the moments you needed acknowledgement and received indifference instead. You remembered how small that felt, how invisible. And remembering didn't make you angry, it made you certain. Certainty doesn't shout, it doesn't tremble, it doesn't waver. They apologized in paragraphs. You healed in silence. They tried to explain their behavior. You no longer needed explanations. You understood it perfectly now, and understanding didn't make it acceptable. Clarity doesn't always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes it leads to distance. You didn't acknowledge their apologies because acknowledging would have implied the conversation was still open. It wasn't. You had already closed it gently, firmly, for good. They wanted forgiveness. You chose freedom. Forgiveness doesn't require reconnection. Forgiveness doesn't require response. Forgiveness can be internal, quiet, and final. You forgave what needed forgiving so you could move forward, but you didn't confuse forgiveness with access. They kept calling because they couldn't accept that their timing disqualified them. Every unanswered call reinforced a lesson they avoided learning sooner. You don't get unlimited chances with someone who gave you their best. You don't get to damage trust and then demand proximity during repair. You don't get closure on your terms after ignoring someone else's boundaries. You didn't acknowledge the apologies because apologies are about accountability, and accountability doesn't demand response. Accountability accepts outcome. They weren't ready for that. They wanted reassurance. You offered none. You chose silence not because you had nothing to say, but because saying anything would have cost you your peace, and peace became non-negotiable. They replayed memories, trying to remind you of what once was. They hoped nostalgia would override discernment, but nostalgia doesn't heal patterns. It just romanticizes them. You refused to be pulled back into something that already proved it couldn't hold you safely. You noticed how your body felt calmer without contact, how your mind stopped racing, how your days felt lighter. That physical relief told you everything you needed to know. The nervous system doesn't lie. They tried different approaches, softer messages, firmer ones, guilt, remorse, logic, emotion, silence, followed by another attempt. You watched the cycle without stepping into it. Observing without engaging is a form of mastery. You didn't know them growth at the expense of your healing. Not picking up the phone was the first time you fully honored yourself. Not acknowledging the apologies was the moment you accepted that some endings don't need dialogue. Some endings just need distance. They wondered if you were ever going to respond. They checked their phone constantly. They reread what they sent. They analyzed every minute of silence. And in that waiting, they experienced a fraction of what you once endured: uncertainty, vulnerability, lack of control. But this wasn't revenge. It was balance. You weren't trying to teach them a lesson. Life already was. You were just no longer interrupting the process. You understood something essential. Not every apology deserves a stage. Not every regret deserves your attention. Not every reconnection deserves a chance. You had already given your chances when it mattered. They kept calling because they couldn't reach you emotionally anymore. They apologized because they finally understood what losing you meant. But understanding doesn't undo impact. Awareness doesn't reverse damage. You didn't acknowledge it because you had already moved on internally. The emotional goodbye happened long before the silence. By the time they reached out, you were already somewhere else mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And that's what they couldn't accept. You didn't disappear dramatically. You didn't block loudly. You didn't make announcements. You simply withdrew, quietly, completely. That quiet withdrawal was your power. They'll always remember the unanswered calls, the messages left on read or not read at all, the silence that followed their apologies, not because you were cruel, but because you were finished. And you'll remember the peace that came from choosing yourself. That's the ending they didn't get to negotiate. And in that silence, something irreversible happened. You reclaimed your authority over your own life. Each unanswered call wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. Each ignored apology wasn't cruelty, it was self-respect finally put into practice. You weren't withholding a response to make a point. You were protecting a boundary that cost you too much to rebuild. They waited for anger because anger would have meant you were still emotionally invested. They waited for confrontation because confrontation would have meant there was still a conversation to be had. What they got instead was distance, clean, quiet, unnegotiable. And that kind of distance forces people to sit with themselves. They told others you were being heartless. They framed your silence as punishment. But deep down they knew the truth: you weren't punishing them. You were done paying the emotional price for their growth. You had already paid enough. The hardest part for them wasn't that you didn't answer, it was that you didn't need to. Your life didn't pause. Your days didn't collapse. Your world didn't fall apart without them. That realization hurt more than rejection ever could, because rejection still implies desire. Indifference does not. They say it behind your back, not because they have nothing to say, but because they don't have the courage to say it where you can hear it. And that right there is power. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, the kind that settles in the room before you even speak, the kind that rearranges people's spines, makes their throats dry, makes them rehearse sentences they'll never dare to deliver. They gossip in safe spaces, in whispers, in group chats, in corners where your presence can't disrupt their confidence. They sound bold there, sharp, opinionated, brave, but put them in front of you and suddenly their words shrink. Suddenly it's smiles, politeness, neutral tones, awkward laughter. Suddenly they remember manners. Suddenly they remember respect. That contrast isn't accidental. It's instinct. Their body knows what their mouth won't admit. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it watches. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to call them out. You don't need to correct the narrative. The fact that they can't look you in the eye and repeat what they say in private already tells you everything. If their truth collapses in your presence, it was never truth, just fear dressed up as commentary. They say you changed. They say you're cold. They say you think you're better now. But they only say it where you can't hear it, because saying it to your face would require them to stand on it, and they don't have the spine to stand on anything real. Real power doesn't demand attention. It creates gravity. People adjust themselves around it. They speak differently. They behave carefully. They calculate. They edit. They filter. They walk on verbal eggshells. You don't even have to raise your voice. You don't even have to explain yourself. Your presence already does the work. That's why they talk behind your back, because behind your back is the only place they feel taller than you. They need distance to feel brave. Up close, they feel exposed. They notice it too, even if they'll never admit it. The way the room shifts when you enter, the way conversations pause, the way laughter dulls, the way people suddenly become busy. That's not coincidence, that's awareness. They know who they can play with and who they can't. You're no longer someone they can test without consequence. They remember the version of you who tolerated nonsense, who explained themselves, who tried to be understood, who gave chances. That version made them comfortable. Comfortable people get careless. Careless people get loud. But that version isn't here anymore. This version doesn't argue. This version doesn't defend. This version doesn't react on cue. And nothing unsettles weak characters more than someone who refuses to perform. They want a reaction, something to justify the stories they tell about you. Anger would be perfect. Tears would be even better. A confrontation would give them material. But silence, detachment, calm, that starves their narrative. So they move it underground. They whisper it where it can survive. Behind your back, because they can't afford to be exposed in front of you. You don't chase respect. You don't beg for understanding. You don't seek validation from rooms that were never built for your growth. And that independence feels like an accusation to people who live on approval. They feel judged by your composure, threatened by your boundaries, smaller around your self-control. You don't have to insult them for them to feel insulted. You don't have to compete for them to feel defeated. Your discipline is louder than their insults. They call it arrogance because confidence that doesn't ask permission scares people who survive by consensus. You don't need agreement. You don't need applause. You don't need to be liked. That's a dangerous combination to insecure minds. They watch how you don't explain your absence, how you don't announce your exits, how you don't warn before withdrawing access. You don't punish, you disengage. And disengagement feels like rejection to people addicted to relevance. So they talk. They talk because talking makes them feel less invisible. They talk because silence would force them to sit with their own inadequacy. They talk because saying your name gives them temporary importance. But notice this, no matter what they say, they still behave carefully around you. They don't cross lines directly. They don't challenge you openly. They don't provoke you where it counts. Their courage has conditions. Their boldness has borders. That's not dominance. That's submission disguised as opinion. If they truly believed what they said, they'd say it standing straight, looking you in the eye. If they truly felt superior, they wouldn't need an audience that excludes you. If they truly had power, they wouldn't fear your response or your lack of one. The fact that they whisper tells you everything. Power doesn't need witnesses. Weakness does. You've reached a level where people monitor their tone around you, where jokes get reconsidered, where words get weighed before being released. That's not intimidation through force, that's authority through self-mastery. You don't threaten, you don't posture, you don't over-explain, you don't chase control. You simply exist without needing permission, and that makes people uncomfortable in ways they can't articulate. They say you're hard to read now. What they really mean is they can't manipulate you anymore. They say you're distant. What they really mean is you're no longer emotionally available to nonsense. They say you're too quiet. What they really mean is they can't predict you. Unpredictability terrifies people who rely on patterns. They keep tabs on you while pretending not to care. They analyze your silence. They overinterpret your absence. They wonder if you know what they've said. They wonder if you're watching. That paranoia is the tax of talking behind someone's back. You never know how much they know. And you don't need to know everything. You already know enough. You know that anyone who can't face you directly doesn't deserve access to you indirectly. You know that real confidence doesn't require commentary. You know that power is when your name is spoken softly, not shouted. They feel brave in groups. Alone they fold. That tells you their strength is borrowed. Yours is internal. They mistake your silence for ignorance. They mistake your restraint for weakness. They mistake your calm for compliance. Until one day they realize you've moved on without announcement, without noise, without drama. And that's when it hits them. They were never part of the future you were building. They were spectators the whole time. They talk behind your back because they can't enter your life anymore. They talk because it's the only access left. They talk because relevance feels better than being forgotten. But you don't respond, you don't retaliate, you don't correct the record. Because real power doesn't chase rumors, it outgrows them. You don't need to clear your name in rooms you've already outgrown. You don't need to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to win arguments with people who can't even say them to your face. Your restraint isn't fear, it's selectivity. You choose where your energy goes. You choose who gets access. You choose silence when noise would lower your position. That choice alone puts you above most people emotionally. They sense it. That's why they keep your name in their mouth, but never on their lips when you're present. They know confrontation would expose them. They know eye contact would dissolve their confidence. They know your calm would dismantle their performance. So they stay behind your back where they feel safe. And that's the truth about power no one likes to admit. When people can't challenge you directly, they try to shrink you indirectly. But shrinking someone behind their back never actually makes them smaller. It just proves they've already grown beyond reach. You don't need revenge. You don't need acknowledgement. You don't need validation. Your power is already confirmed by their silence in your presence, by their noise in your absence, by their fear of saying out loud what they rehearse in private. That's real power. Not being feared loudly, but being respected quietly. And the quietest proof of that power is this: you don't even have to change your behavior to maintain it. You don't posture, you don't intimidate on purpose, you don't walk in trying to dominate the room. You simply remain consistent, grounded, unbothered. That consistency is what unsettles them, because people who rely on performance can't compete with authenticity. They keep waiting for you to slip, to react emotionally, to say something reckless, to give them proof that their behind-the-back commentary was justified. But you don't. You stay composed. You stay measured. You stay uninterested. And that discipline eats at them far more than any confrontation ever could. They start censoring themselves even when you're not around, because the idea of you overhearing even hypothetically makes them uncomfortable. Your presence lingers. That's power too. Not domination of space, but occupation of mind. You live rent-free in the very people who pretend you're irrelevant. They'll never admit it out loud, but every person they meet now gets compared to you. Every conversation, every glance, every moment is measured against the way you once made them feel. And every single time, reality disappoints them. Because the truth is simple. You were irreplaceable, and they never realized it until you were gone. They didn't understand your worth when you were right there, loving them effortlessly. They mistook your kindness for abundance, as if people like you grow on trees. They thought they could do better. They thought they could upgrade. But now they're learning the cruelest lesson of all: quality doesn't repeat. They didn't realize your presence was rare. Your empathy, your patience, your loyalty, those things don't come packaged in every new face they chase. Now, every time they try to connect with someone else, the emptiness reminds them of what they threw away. It's a curse they placed on themselves. They wander from person to person, searching for something familiar, something comforting, something powerful, but it never arrives. Because the spark they felt with you wasn't chemistry, it was alignment, destiny, divine timing, and they shattered it with their own hands. They thought moving on would be easy. They thought replacing you would be quick. But now they're drowning in the realization that what you offered came once in a lifetime. And the people they seek now can't even match your shadow. Your silence haunts them. Your absence exposes the cheapness of everything they're settling for now. They can't find your depth in shallow waters. They can't find your strength in fragile hearts. They can't find your authenticity in people who only pretend. You were the standard, and nothing they meet now even comes close. They scroll through contacts, through messages, through memories, hoping something will numb the ache, but nothing does. Because the standard you set wasn't emotional, it was spiritual. You touched places in them they didn't even know existed, and they'll spend years trying to fill those empty spaces. Every new conversation reminds them of your wit. Every argument reminds them of your honesty. Every silence reminds them of your peace. They try to replicate the bond, but all they're doing is chasing ghosts, you being the biggest one. They didn't appreciate how you understood them without explanation. They didn't appreciate how you forgave them before they even apologized. They didn't appreciate the way you knew their flaws and still chose them. Now they're encountering people who won't tolerate even a fraction of what you accepted. And reality hits them hard. You weren't demanding. You were balanced. You weren't clingy. You were loyal. You weren't soft. You were golden. And they treated gold like dust. Now they're left with hands full of sand. They can't replicate the comfort you provided. They can't recreate the peace you brought. They can't revive the magic you naturally radiated. And each disappointment feels like punishment for taking you for granted. Their ego dies a little each time they realize the people they chase now don't stay. They don't invest. They don't care the way you did. Because what you brought to the table wasn't normal, it was exceptional. They thought they were the prize, the catch, the rare one. But losing you showed them the truth. You were the blessing. You were the shift. You were the upgrade. And now they're stuck with the uncomfortable knowledge that they fumbled something extraordinary. They remember the softness of your voice, the way you listened without judgment, the way you made them feel safe, and they know deep down they won't ever experience that combination again. That realization gnaws at them, day after day. They replay your laughter now, realizing how genuine it was. They replay your words, realizing how wise they were. They replay your loyalty, realizing how unwavering it was. And all they can do is wish they had treated you better when they had the chance. You set a bar they can't reach anymore. Not because others aren't good enough, but because the version of them who had access to you no longer exists. They burn that version trying to impress the wrong crowds. Every time they look into someone else's eyes, they search for your fire. Every time someone touches their hand, they look for your warmth. Every time they feel lonely, they crave your presence. But replacements don't heal regret. They're bumping into the consequences of mistaking your love for weakness. They're learning that strong souls don't beg, they move on. And once they move on, no force on earth can bring them back. They didn't just lose a person, they lost a future. Every road they walk now is haunted by the thought of what could have been if they had simply matured, cared, and chosen you properly. The thought follows them like a shadow that never fades. You were the one thing in their life that wasn't temporary. You were the one they could have built an entire world with. But they chose chaos, ego, pride, and now all they're left with is the ache of realizing that you were the safest place they ever had. Time will pass, years will shift, people will come and go, but the memory of you will stay carved into the back of their mind like a scar they gave themselves. They'll forget faces, forget names, forget moments, but they'll never forget you. Because you weren't just someone they loved. You were the standard, the blueprint, the bar no one else can reach. And that is the punishment life gives to those who mishandle rare souls. They will search for you in everyone, and never find you again. They didn't realize that once someone experiences a presence like yours, every connection after feels half awake. That's why they wander through people like someone flipping through static channels, waiting for a signal that feels like what you effortlessly were. But the truth is simple, they won't find it. Not because others aren't good enough, but because what you brought wasn't something that can be copied, mimicked, or manufactured. It was born from who you are, not from what you did. They replay your conversations in their mind now, trying to understand how you carried so much weight with so few words, how your silence said more than other people's paragraphs, how your presence felt like a mirror and a challenge at the same time. They didn't appreciate it when they had it because they assumed you'd always stay. But losing you taught them the language of emptiness, and its fluency they never wanted. They sit with the realization that they didn't upgrade when they left, you did. While they tried to find someone easier, more predictable, more bendable, you became someone stronger, colder, wiser. You grew in ways they'll never be able to understand. And now you're the version of yourself they always hoped you wouldn't become, the one who doesn't need them at all. Their mistake wasn't treating you badly. Their mistake was treating you badly while assuming you'd never change. They believed your kindness was dependence. They believed your patience was weakness. They believed your effort was lack of options. And now they're learning the most painful truth. You were never the one who needed them. They were the one who needed you. They scroll through people's faces, hoping something sparks the familiarity you once gave them without trying. But nothing lands, nothing sticks, nothing feels real. Because you weren't just a person, you were a standard, a level, a league they never earned but were lucky enough to touch. And now that you're gone, they walk through their days comparing everyone to a memory they ruined. They remember the way you made them feel seen, understood, valued, and challenged. They remember the way you encouraged their growth even when they didn't appreciate it. They remember the way you corrected them with respect, not humiliation. They remember the way you carried yourself with quiet strength. And now, they realize that those qualities aren't normal, they were rare, priceless, almost impossible to find again. They finally understand why people say you don't meet someone like that twice. Because someone like you isn't a coincidence, you're a turning point. And they treated a turning point like a temporary stop. That's why they're stuck now emotionally, mentally, spiritually, because the moment they mishandled you, their story stopped progressing. They replay the details of your presence like a movie they didn't know would become their favorite until it was too late. The way you listened, the way you spoke, the way you noticed things others always overlooked, the way you carried dignity even when disrespected, the way you never needed loudness to make an impact. They missed the subtlety of you, the depth of you, the steadiness of you. And the scariest part for them is knowing they'll never experience it again. Others come with noise, drama, insecurity, and expectations they can't meet. With you, everything felt elevated not because you tried, but because your energy carried a weight that commanded sincerity. They left thinking they'd find better. They come back realizing they'll only find busier, louder, needier, not better. Now they understand why your absence is louder than your presence ever had to be. Because when someone loses a standard, everything becomes a downgrade. And no matter who they date, who they chase, who they settle for, none of them can offer what you did. Authenticity without performance, depth without chaos, love without conditions. They never saw it coming. They thought you were just another casualty, another name to fade away in the credits, another soul broken by their cruelty. They thought their betrayal would destroy you, that their disrespect would silence you, that their lies would erase your spark. But oh, how wrong they were. You weren't the tragedy of the story, you were the turning point. You weren't the downfall, you were the climax. They thought your silence was surrender. They thought your absence was defeat. What they didn't realize was that you were simply gathering momentum, letting the noise burn itself out while you sharpened your purpose. They thought they'd written your ending, but the truth is, you were only in the middle of your rise. You were never meant to be the victim, you were destined to be the revelation. You see, people like them thrive on seeing others break. They feed on reaction, on validation, on chaos, but you didn't give them any of that. You didn't crumble, you didn't beg, you didn't chase. You simply vanished into your silence, and that silence became your power. While they were busy performing their false victory, you were busy rewriting the story in your favor. And when you came back calm, composed, unbothered, they didn't know how to process it, because people like them expect pain, not peace. They expect tears, not transformation. They wanted to see you shattered. Instead, they saw you shining. They wanted to see you lost. Instead, they found themselves irrelevant. You didn't just survive, you shifted the entire tone of the story. They made you a subplot, but you became the main event. They thought they'd closed the chapter, but you became the whole book. That's what true power looks like, not vengeance, not destruction, but evolution. The kind that leaves everyone stunned because you didn't just move on. You leveled up, and that's the part that haunts them now. You were supposed to break, but you built. You were supposed to fade, but you flourished. They can't comprehend how the same person they tried to bury became the heartbeat of the story, the climax that redefined everything. Now, when your name comes up, the room changes. There's a pause, a silence, a recognition that they underestimated you, that the one they mocked, doubted, and discarded became the standard. You became the proof that pain doesn't end you, it refines you. That endings aren't always losses, sometimes they're transformations. You didn't just survive what they did, you turned it into fuel. Every insult became motivation. Every betrayal became clarity. Every failure became focus. You didn't just walk through the fire, you became it. And now, when they look at you, they see the flames of everything they thought would destroy you, burning quietly in your eyes. That's what makes you dangerous. You don't need revenge. You don't need recognition. You don't even need closure. Your success is the closure. Your peace is the payback. You became untouchable because you stopped looking for justice in places that couldn't handle your truth. You let time reveal what you already knew, that the one who stays silent often becomes the loudest name in the end. They used to talk about you. Now, they talk around you. Because deep down, they know they can't handle the fact that they created the very thing they now fear, your evolution. You became a living reminder of their failure. The moment they tried to break you was the same moment they unknowingly built their own downfall. They thought they had the power because they caused your pain. But the real power came when you turned that pain into purpose. When you stopped trying to prove your worth to the unworthy. When you chose distance over drama, peace over performance, silence over screaming. That's when the plot flipped. That's when the climax began. Now, they can't write you off. You're too evolved, too aware, too centered. You exist in a space they can't reach emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You're not a participant in their chaos anymore. You're the mirror that exposes it. You're what happens when pain grows teeth and learns to smile. And that's what hurts them the most. They can't take credit for your rise. They can only take the blame for inspiring it. You didn't just outgrow them, you outclassed them. The same people who once looked down on you now have to look up to see you. You became the climax because you became unshakable. Every scar became a sentence. Every wound became wisdom. Every silence became strategy. And when the dust settled, you were still standing, not as a casualty of their story, but as the author of your own. Now, they tell the story differently. They downplay their part, soften their guilt, twist the details. But no matter how they frame it, one truth remains: you were never their victim. You were the plot twist they couldn't predict. So when they say your name now, it carries weight. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. Because you didn't just survive their chaos, you redefined it. You taught them that not every ending is tragic, and not every silence is surrender. Sometimes, the quietest moment in the story is the most powerful one of all, the climax. And that's who you are now, the calm after the storm, the evolution they never saw coming, the story they wish they could rewrite. But it's too late. The ending is already written. The lesson is already learned. You were never meant to die in their plot. You were meant to end it. You were never the casualty. You were always the climax. They still replay it in their minds, the part where they thought they'd ruined you. They remember the moment they delivered the final blow, expecting you to crumble, to beg, to break. But instead, you smiled. Calm, collected, dangerous. That was the first sign they missed the calm before the reckoning. You weren't lost. You were calculating. You weren't broken. You were becoming. They didn't realize the storm they unleashed when they underestimated your silence. You didn't fight back because you were scared. You stayed quiet because you were done. There's a difference. They thought your lack of reaction meant defeat, but it was discipline. You were saving your energy for the transformation that would make them irrelevant. You were turning their betrayal into blueprint. It's funny, isn't it? They thought they had you cornered, that you were another pawn in their game. They never knew you were the one who designed the board. They were playing checkers while you were mastering chess. Every move they made against you only revealed more about them, their weakness, their ego, their fear. And while they were too busy trying to expose you, they ended up exposing themselves. Now they whisper. They pretend they've moved on, but they still look for your shadow in every room. They still measure others by you, wondering how someone they once belittled became the standard. That's the curse of underestimating the quiet ones. They think silence means submission, when in truth, it means strategy. You didn't react emotionally because you already knew how it would end. And when it ended your way. No revenge, no theatrics, no mess. Just distance, just silence, just undeniable growth. That's what makes it burn. You didn't have to destroy them. They destroyed themselves trying to destroy you. The collapse they planned for you became their own downfall. They were loud when they thought they'd won. Now, they're quiet confused, haunted. Because while they wasted time plotting your pain, you built peace, and peace is power. You didn't need to prove your worth. Your evolution did it for you. The very things they tried to use against you became your foundation. Their rejection built your resilience. Their lies fueled your clarity. You became everything they claimed you could never be: calm, controlled, powerful. Not because you wanted to prove them wrong, but because you stopped needing their validation altogether. That's what they'll never understand. Your victory wasn't revenge. It was release. You let go of their chaos. And in doing so, you won a game they didn't even realize you were playing. Now, they see it. The glow, the peace, the unbothered energy that doesn't chase or explain. It unsettles them. Because people who manipulate chaos don't know what to do with peace. They can't control someone who doesn't react. They can't guilt someone who doesn't care. You became a mirror, one that forces them to face the ugliness they tried to bury under your name. They call it coldness, but it's not cold, it's clarity. It's what happens when you finally see people for who they are, not who you wanted them to be. They mistook your loyalty for weakness, your kindness for naivety, your silence for fear. And by the time they realized the truth, you were gone, out of reach, out of their control, out of their story. You didn't just survive, you ascended. You turned the pain into armor, the lessons into strategy, and the past into poetry. You became untouchable because you learned how to walk away without leaving pieces of yourself behind. They're still trying to figure out how you did it, how you stood in the ruins they built for you and turned them into a throne. Forgive them? No, not because you're bitter, but because forgiveness doesn't mean restoring access, and what they did disqualified them from ever touching your life again. They expected mercy to look like memory loss. They thought time would erase accountability, but time didn't erase anything. It exposed everything. Their hell isn't fire or chaos. It's watching you move on untouched while they carry the weight of what they broke. They thought forgiveness meant comfort. Instead, they got consequences wrapped in silence. They will see hell in the way doors close quietly in front of them, in how your absence becomes permanent, in how nothing feels the same once you're gone. They thought apologies could undo behavior. They learned too late that apologies don't reverse damage, they only highlight it. Their hell is realizing you healed without them, that you didn't need closure from the people who caused the wound. They expected anger so they could argue it away. What they got was indifference, and indifference starves ego. They will see hell every time they try to explain their side and realize no one is listening anymore. They thought they could return once things cooled down. They didn't understand that cold decisions don't reheat. Their hell is watching you succeed without bitterness, no revenge, no noise, just distance and growth. They assumed forgiveness meant access. You taught them forgiveness can coexist with permanent removal. They will feel it in moments they can't fix, in memories they can't revisit, in doors that no longer open. They thought time would soften you. Time sharpened your boundaries instead. Their hell is knowing they lost you not because of one mistake, but because of a pattern they refused to change. They expected your heart to stay open forever. They didn't realize hearts close when they're disrespected long enough. They will see hell in how calm you are now. Calm after chaos is terrifying to those who caused the storm. They thought you'd forgive and forget. You forgave yourself for staying too long and never forgot the lesson. Their hell is realizing you're no longer emotionally available to be hurt by them. They thought they mattered more than your peace. They were wrong. They will feel it when they try to recreate you and others and fail every time. Their hell is comparison. Every connection after you will remind them of what they lost. They expected a dramatic ending. What they got was a quiet one, and quiet endings are permanent. They thought they could walk back in later. They didn't realize you changed the locks internally. Their hell is seeing you thrive without needing to prove anything. They assumed forgiveness meant you'd still care. But caring ended when respect disappeared. They will see hell in the form of regret that arrives too late to matter. They thought you'd carry resentment. You carried discipline instead. Their hell is understanding that you didn't destroy them, you simply removed yourself. They will feel it in the absence of your loyalty, your effort, your presence. They thought you were replaceable. Time will prove otherwise. Their hell is knowing they can't undo what they did, and you won't pretend it didn't happen. They expected softness after damage. You chose strength. They will see hell every time they remember how easily you walked away once clarity arrived. They thought forgiveness meant resetting the clock. You ended the entire chapter. Their hell is realizing they didn't lose you angrily, they lost you intelligently. They assumed you'd always be there. You proved always ends when disrespect becomes familiar. They will live with the knowledge that you didn't curse them. You didn't fight them. You didn't seek revenge. You simply left. And that absence became the consequence they can never escape. Their hell will begin the moment they realize forgiveness was never the goal. Growth was, and growth doesn't look back to rescue people who chose to harm. They will feel it in the silence where your presence used to soften everything. Silence has a way of amplifying regret when there's nothing left to distract from it. They thought forgiveness would mean relief. Instead, they got awareness, the slow, crushing understanding of what they lost. Their hell will be watching you live freely without carrying bitterness. Nothing hurts worse than knowing you didn't destroy yourself over them. They expected time to blur their mistakes. But time sharpened them, turning memories into permanent reminders. They will feel it when their name no longer has power over your emotions. When their existence becomes neutral, irrelevant, small, their hell is realizing you don't even need to dislike them anymore. Dislike still means engagement. You moved beyond that. They thought you would soften once the pain faded. They didn't realize pain didn't harden you, clarity did. They will see hell in the way you no longer explain yourself. No defenses, no justifications, just distance. They assumed forgiveness meant re-entry, but forgiveness only released you, not them. Their hell is the loss of access to your energy, your loyalty, your protection, things they took for granted until they vanished. They will feel it in moments where they wish they could reach out and realize they can't. They thought remorse would save them. They didn't understand remorse without change is meaningless. Their hell is knowing you didn't need them to heal. You healed by removing the source. They will see it when others don't tolerate what you once endured. That comparison will haunt them. They expected you to stay emotionally available. You chose emotional sovereignty instead. Their hell is watching you trust again, just not them. They thought forgiveness meant forgetting. You remembered enough to never repeat the mistake. They will feel it when they realize you're not angry anymore. Anger still gives people importance. Indifference does not. Their hell is knowing you didn't lose yourself, you found yourself the moment you walked away. They expected consequences to look dramatic. They didn't expect them to look permanent. They will see it in the calm way you move now. Calm is what remains after you stop fighting battles that aren't worth it. They thought they could live with what they did. They didn't realize memory has weight. Their hell is understanding that you didn't punish them, life adjusted accordingly once you stepped out of the way. They assumed forgiveness was something they were entitled to. You showed them forgiveness is personal, not transactional. They will live knowing the version of you they had access to no longer exists because they helped destroy it. Their hell begins with the silence you never break. No messages, no explanations, no emotional leftovers. Just absence doing its quiet work. Absence that answers everything. They will feel it when they realize forgiveness wasn't denied. Access was. Energy was. Time was. And those things never return once revoked. That loss hits slower but deeper. Their hell shows up when they finally mature. When awareness arrives late. When growth hurts instead of heals. when they understand what they mishandled and realize you are no longer available. That timing will crush them. They will feel it when your name no longer reacts inside them. No anger, no warmth, no longing, just neutrality. Neutrality is devastating to ego. Their hell lives in comparison. Every new connection falls short. Every bond feels thinner. Every loyalty feels forced, because they once had depth and chose to waste it. They will notice it when you stop being part of their story. No references, no mentions, no memories shared. You exit the narrative completely, and erasure hurts more than blame. Their hell arrives when apologies feel useless, because there's no audience left, no door to knock on, no chance to redeem, no stage for regret, just accountability with nowhere to go. They will feel it in moments of loneliness, when distractions fail, when silence grows heavy, when reflection becomes unavoidable, and your absence becomes undeniable. That's when it settles in. Their hell is watching you forgive internally, not for them, but for yourself, because that freedom removes leverage and leaves them powerless. Powerlessness terrifies manipulators. They will notice it when you no longer flinch. No reactions, no emotional hooks, no triggers. You've healed past reach. That distance burns quietly. Their hell is realizing you didn't win by hurting them. You won by disengaging, by choosing peace, by choosing growth, by choosing finality. Finality has weight. They will feel it when you succeed without explanation. No announcements, no justifications, no need for validation. Your progress speaks alone, and it speaks loudly. Their hell is knowing you didn't become cold randomly. You became selective, intentional, protective, and they taught you how. That truth stings. They will feel it when they understand this wasn't punishment. It was consequence. Natural, earned, unavoidable, and permanent. Their hell ends where yours begins. With peace, with clarity, with boundaries intact. You moved forward clean and left them behind with the lesson. They were ready for chaos, for tears, for questions that would keep them relevant. They wanted you to demand explanations, to unravel in confusion, to give them the satisfaction of being the center of your emotional storm. Instead, you gave them nothing but a quiet pivot forward. They wanted to scream why, because why keeps a door open. It creates space for excuses, justifications, and emotional bargaining. But you didn't ask. You didn't pause. You moved on like the answer no longer mattered. They expected a reaction that would prove they still mattered. Raised voices, shaking hands, late-night messages. But you skipped all of that and whispered next, like they were already behind you. They weren't prepared for how quickly you detached. One moment they thought they were significant, the next they were irrelevant. That speed unsettled them more than any argument ever could. They wanted to explain themselves, to rewrite the story, to control the narrative. But you didn't stay long enough to hear it. You understood that explanations don't change patterns, and patterns were already clear. They stood there with words loaded on their tongue, ready to defend, justify, manipulate. You didn't give them a stage. You didn't give them time. You simply exited the scene. They thought you would need answers to heal. They didn't realize clarity had already arrived. When clarity shows up, questions disappear. They wanted to scream because screaming is a last attempt at power, but you had already reclaimed yours by choosing momentum over meaning. They were still emotionally unpacking the situation while you were already closing the door. That difference in timing made them feel foolish and exposed. They thought the bond meant you'd hesitate, that you'd slow down, that you'd look back. But you moved forward without dragging the past behind you. They wanted to see pain in your eyes. Instead, they saw decision, calm, resolve, and that terrified them. They wanted to argue about what went wrong. You understood what went wrong the moment respect left the room. No discussion required. They believed you would need closure from them. They didn't realize closure is something you give yourself when you stop expecting decency from people who've already shown you who they are. They wanted to scream why because they couldn't accept how easily you let go. But letting go wasn't easy, it was necessary. They were still emotionally stuck in the moment they lost control. You had already mentally stepped into the next chapter. They wanted to negotiate feelings. You were already renegotiating your standards upward. They expected nostalgia to slow you down, memories to soften you. But memories don't outweigh self-respect once it finally wakes up. They tried to pull you back into conversation, into emotion, into unfinished business. You denied them all of it with a single choice: forward. They were still searching for reasons. You were already searching for better. They wanted your attention, even if it came in the form of anger. But you didn't even give them that courtesy. They mistook your silence for shock. It wasn't shock, it was certainty. They wanted to scream because they felt discarded. You didn't discard them emotionally. You simply stopped carrying what no longer belonged to you. They were desperate for a reaction that would confirm they mattered. But indifference is the loudest confirmation that someone no longer does. They stayed behind asking why me, while you moved on asking what's next. They thought endings had to be dramatic to be real. You proved that the most final endings are the quiet ones. They wanted closure through conversation. You chose closure through action. They were still processing the loss. You had already accepted the lesson. They expected you to break stride. You didn't even slow your pace. They wanted to scream because they felt powerless. And they were right the moment you said next, their power disappeared. They tried to haunt your thoughts, but your mind was already occupied with growth, direction, and distance. They couldn't believe how quickly you replaced confusion with clarity, pain with progress, attachment with discipline. They wanted a dramatic goodbye. You gave them a silent departure. They wanted you to look back one last time. You didn't. Because looking back would have been a waste of momentum. They stayed behind with questions echoing in their chest. You walked forward with answers you no longer needed to explain. They wanted to scream why to keep you emotionally tied. But you whispered next. And in that single word, you chose time, power, and self-respect over a conversation that no longer deserved you. They weren't ready for how little time you gave them to matter after everything they did. They expected delays, emotional traffic, a long goodbye. But you treated time like currency and refused to spend another second on something already bankrupt. They wanted your pause, your hesitation, your doubt, because doubt is where influence lives. But you didn't pause long enough for them to step back in. They stood there rehearsing explanations while you were already walking away. Their words expired before they ever reached your ears. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing you wrestle with the decision. Instead, you moved like the decision had been made long ago because it had. They thought your silence meant you were overwhelmed. In truth, silence meant you were finished processing. There was nothing left to discuss. They wanted to scream why because why would make them feel important. But you no longer measured importance by history, only by alignment. They weren't prepared for how unemotional your exit was. Not cold out of cruelty, but cold out of clarity. Clarity doesn't linger. They tried to slow you down with memories, inside jokes, old promises. But nostalgia doesn't work on someone who has outgrown the past. They wanted you to stumble one last time, just to prove you were human. But growth sometimes looks ruthless to people who stay the same. They couldn't accept that you didn't need their explanation to validate your experience. You trusted what you saw, not what they said. They thought you'd collapse before moving on. Instead, you reorganized your life like they were never meant to be permanent furniture. They wanted emotional mess because mess keeps doors open. You chose clean lines and closed doors. They asked questions out loud. You answered them privately and moved forward. They didn't realize how long it takes someone to say next without bitterness. That word doesn't come from impulse, it comes from exhaustion meeting self-respect. They wanted to stay relevant through confusion, but you replaced confusion with direction. They expected you to circle back eventually, to miss them loudly, to regret quietly. But you never circled back, you elevated. They were still unpacking emotions while you were packing lessons. They wanted your healing to involve them. You healed by removing them. They tried to make you feel heartless. But heartless people don't love deeply first. You did, and that's why your ending was so clean. They mistook your quick exit for lack of depth. But only deep people know when to leave without dragging damage behind them. They stayed stuck in the moment things fell apart. You treated that moment as a checkpoint, not a destination. They wanted time to explain themselves into a better ending. You understood endings aren't negotiated after disrespect. They thought, why would haunt you? But next liberated you. They wanted closure through conversation. You chose closure through movement. They are still standing where you left them, wondering how it ended so fast. They didn't expect how settled you looked after leaving. Not rushed, not shaken, not unsure. Settled like someone who finally stopped carrying unnecessary weight. They wanted your departure to look impulsive so they could dismiss it later. But it wasn't impulsive, it was precise. And precision leaves no room for return. They kept waiting for regret to show up on your face. Days passed, silence stretched. Regret never came. That absence disturbed them more than anger ever could. They thought time would soften you. That distance would make you nostalgic. Instead, distance made you sharper and more certain. They wanted you to feel the loss loudly, but you processed it quietly, internally, efficiently, like something already resolved. They couldn't understand how someone could leave without needing validation. They don't know what it's like to trust your own judgment completely. They expected you to look back just once, to hesitate at the door, but you closed it with the same calm you used to open your next chapter. They wanted you to suffer visibly so they could feel forgiven indirectly, but your peace denied them that comfort. They mistook your quick transition for emotional numbness. In reality, it was emotional mastery. They stayed, hoping for a delayed reaction, a message, a question, a crack. None came. They realized too late that next wasn't dismissal, it was selection. You chose yourself without ceremony. They wanted to remain a reference point in your life. Instead, they became a lesson you no longer revisit. They thought endings had to echo, but yours landed clean and silent, leaving nothing to debate. They are still trying to process what happened. You've already integrated it and moved forward. And the hardest truth for them is this: you didn't leave angrily, you didn't leave broken, you didn't leave confused, you left ready. They feel foolish because the game they designed so carefully ended with them trapped by their own moves. They thought they were clever, manipulating from the shadows, but they never realized you were watching the board the entire time. They believed you were reacting emotionally while they were thinking strategically. What they didn't know was that you were doing both, feeling nothing while calculating everything. That combination made you dangerous. They thought they were leading you, but they were only revealing themselves. Every lie, every delay, every half-truth became another predictable move. And predictable players always lose. They feel stupid now because you never interrupted their performance. You let them talk, scheme, and overplay their hand. You understood that the fastest way to win is to let your opponent think they're in control. They assumed you were naive because you stayed calm. They mistook patience for blindness. But patience is exactly what allowed you to see the entire pattern while they focused on short-term wins. They feel embarrassed, realizing you never confronted them because you didn't need to. Confrontation would have ended the game too early. You wanted the full picture before delivering the final move. They thought they were manipulating emotions. What they didn't realize is that you had already detached, and manipulating someone who doesn't care is like throwing punches at air. They feel foolish because they celebrated victories that didn't exist. They mistook your silence as submission, your distance as confusion. In reality, you were already planning your exit. They underestimated how observant you were. You noticed tone shifts, inconsistencies, timing gaps. While they focused on deception, you focused on behavior. They feel stupid because you never rushed your decision. You let them reveal their intentions naturally. People always expose themselves when they think they're winning. They thought they were smarter because they talked more. You proved intelligence doesn't need an audience. You listened, processed, and waited. They feel humiliated knowing you saw through the game long before it ended. You weren't figuring things out at the end, you were confirming what you already knew. They expected an emotional breakdown. Instead, they got a clean checkmate. No yelling, no chaos. Just one final move that ended everything instantly. They feel foolish because they tried to play psychological games with someone who mastered emotional control. And emotional control beats manipulation every time. They thought they could outthink you because you didn't argue. But arguing was never the goal. Winning was. They feel exposed because once you walked away, the entire illusion collapsed. Without you participating, their game had no meaning. They didn't realize that by lying, they were giving you leverage. Every contradiction became proof. Every excuse became confirmation. They feel stupid because you never accused them, you let their actions convict them. That's the cleanest checkmate there is. They thought they were ahead because they had information. They didn't realize you had awareness. Awareness always wins. They feel foolish now, replaying conversations, realizing how obvious they were. The signs they thought you missed were the ones you noted first. They underestimated your self-control. They thought emotions ruled you, but you had already separated emotion from decision. They feel embarrassed because the moment you left, they understood they never had power. You allowed them to think they did. They tried to flip the narrative, but it didn't work. You didn't respond. And without reaction, manipulation dies instantly. They feel like amateurs because you never showed your hand. You let them expose theirs completely before moving. They thought they were smart because they planned. You were smarter because you waited. They feel foolish because you never tried to beat them at their own pace. You slowed the game down until their impatience betrayed them. They believed they were setting traps. In reality, they were walking straight into one. They feel stupid because you didn't chase answers. You waited for behavior to answer everything. They thought silence meant weakness. They learned silence can be strategy. They feel embarrassed because when the final move came, it was irreversible. No appeal, no negotiation. They underestimated how well you understood human patterns. You didn't guess, you recognized. They feel foolish because you didn't need revenge. The loss itself was punishment enough. They thought you were emotionally invested in the outcome. You were invested in clarity. They feel humiliated knowing you let them play the entire game, knowing exactly how it would end. They thought they were writing the story. You simply turned the page and ended it. They feel stupid because the checkmate didn't look dramatic. It looked quiet, calm, and final. They underestimated the danger of someone who stays composed while being underestimated. They feel foolish because the moment they realized the truth, it was already too late. They lost not because you cheated, but because you understood the game better than they ever did. And that's the part they can't escape. They weren't beaten by force. They were defeated by intelligence, patience, and a mind they never saw coming. They replay every move now, trying to locate where it all went wrong. But the truth is cruelly simple. It went wrong the moment they assumed you were stupid. Underestimation was the first mistake, and everything after that was just them digging deeper. They feel foolish because you never rushed the game. You never tried to outplay them loudly. You let them believe they were winning while you calmly mapped the end. Nothing humiliates a strategist more than realizing the opponent was never panicking. They can't stop thinking about how confident they were, how smug, how sure they felt, pulling strings they believed you couldn't see. That confidence now feels like self-inflicted embarrassment. They thought manipulation required intelligence. You proved it only requires someone else's ignorance, and you were never ignorant. You were observant, patient, and emotionally disciplined. They feel stupid because you didn't react when they expected you to. Their tricks depended on provoking emotion. When emotion never came, their tactics collapsed under their own weight. They assumed silence meant confusion. They didn't realize silence was calculation. You were counting every inconsistency, every contradiction, every delay. They feel exposed, knowing you let them talk themselves into defeat. You didn't interrupt their lies because lies expand when left alone. You let them build the case against themselves. They thought you were behind because you asked fewer questions. But questions weren't needed. Patterns were already speaking loudly. They feel foolish because the moment you left, everything became clear. The game only worked as long as you participated. Once you withdrew, their strategy had no opponent. They underestimated your emotional restraint. They believed you'd snap, confront, or plead. Instead, you remained composed, which robbed them of every advantage they thought they had. They feel embarrassed because you never raised your voice, never accused, never begged for honesty. You simply watched them reveal who they were. They thought intelligence meant planning moves. You showed them intelligence also means knowing when to stop playing. They feel stupid because your final move didn't look like revenge, it looked like self-respect, and that kind of ending can't be argued with. They underestimated how dangerous patience can be. While they were rushing to control outcomes, you were waiting for certainty. They feel foolish realizing you knew the ending long before they did. You stayed only long enough to confirm it wasn't salvageable. They tried to regain control with explanations and apologies. But once the board is flipped, no move can save the losing side. They feel exposed because you didn't need proof to win. Their behavior was proof enough. They thought they were playing mind games. They didn't realize you were studying psychology. They feel stupid because you never needed to trap them, you let them trap themselves. They underestimated how deeply you understood human behavior. You didn't guess motives, you recognized patterns. They feel humiliated knowing you let them believe they were clever until the very last second. That realization will sting longer than any argument ever could. They thought they'd get a dramatic ending. Instead, they got silence, and silence confirmed defeat. They feel foolish because when they finally saw the truth, there was no way back. The game was already over. They lost because they played against someone who didn't need to win loudly, only decisively. The moment you recognized disloyalty, something in you switched permanently. It wasn't anger, it wasn't heartbreak, it was clarity. You saw their actions the way an investor sees a bad asset, and once that realization hit, there was no emotional debate left to have. You didn't spiral trying to understand why they betrayed you. You simply understood that loyalty was a return they were never capable of providing. And once you saw that, continuing to invest in them felt like intentional self-sabotage. They thought disloyalty would wound you. Instead, it educated you. It showed you exactly who they were, stripped of promises and performance. And once you see the numbers don't add up, you don't pour more into a sinking account. You didn't confront them with drama or accusations. You confronted reality. You realized that trust was the capital, and they had burned through it recklessly. There was nothing left to grow from, only losses waiting to multiply. They expected you to react emotionally, to fight for something already compromised. But you don't fight to save something that proved it doesn't respect your value. You cut losses quietly and moved on with discipline. From that moment on, you never looked at them the same. The admiration died. The benefit of the doubt expired. The image you held of them collapsed under the weight of their own choices. And once an image shatters, it never reforms the same way. You stopped romanticizing their intentions. You stopped justifying their behavior. You stopped pretending potential mattered more than patterns. Disloyalty turned them into a liability in your eyes, not a loss. They didn't realize how final that internal shift was. They thought they could recover your trust with words, apologies, or time. But trust isn't rebuilt once it's treated carelessly. It's reassessed and redirected elsewhere. You began to see how much emotional energy you wasted maintaining something that gave diminishing returns. The imbalance became obvious. You were investing loyalty, patience, and consistency into someone offering excuses and convenience. That realization didn't hurt, it sobered you. You understood that attachment without respect is just emotional debt, and you refused to stay in a position where you were the only one paying. They noticed the distance but misunderstood it. They thought you were upset. They didn't realize you were done evaluating them as a long-term presence in your life. You had already made the decision internally. Once disloyalty entered the picture, they were no longer a priority. They became an example of what happens when someone underestimates the consequences of breaking trust with the wrong person. You didn't need revenge, you didn't need closure. The data was enough. Their actions spoke clearly, and you listened with maturity instead of emotion. You stopped offering access, stopped offering explanations, stopped offering chances. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. You don't reopen failed investments hoping for miracles. They tried to act like nothing had changed, but everything had. You were present physically, but mentally detached. Your loyalty was already reallocated to yourself. What shocked them most was how calm you became. No arguing, no accusations, no emotional breakdown. Just a quiet withdrawal that spoke louder than confrontation ever could. They underestimated how observant you were. They didn't realize you were taking mental notes the entire time. Disloyalty wasn't a surprise, it was the confirmation. Once confirmed, you closed the account. No overdraft, no extensions, no renegotiation. Just a clean exit with dignity intact. You began to see them clearly, without attachment, without fantasy, without excuses. And clarity changes everything. It removes hope where hope is dangerous. They wanted forgiveness. You chose discernment, because forgiveness doesn't mean continued access, and you were done confusing the two. Your standards rose the moment they failed to meet them. You realized loyalty wasn't rare, it was just incompatible with people like them. You never looked up to them again, not because you hated them, but because respect once lost doesn't regenerate. You can't admire what proved itself unreliable. They felt the shift immediately. The warmth disappeared. The effort stopped. The door remained open physically but locked emotionally. They mistook your silence for weakness, but silence was your decision, not your confusion. You had already moved past them mentally. You began investing your energy elsewhere, into peace, growth, discipline, and self-respect. And compared to that, they felt small, noisy, and draining. They couldn't understand how quickly you moved on. But you didn't move on quickly, you moved on decisively. There's a difference. Disloyalty disqualified them from your future. And you don't revisit disqualified options, no matter how familiar they feel. They still hoped you'd see them the way you once did. But once the illusion breaks, it never reforms. You don't unsee betrayal. You became colder, not cruel, sharper, not bitter, selective, not closed. Disloyalty refined you instead of ruining you. They lost access not because you were angry, but because you were intelligent enough to protect your value. You didn't look back because looking back benefits failed investments, not disciplined minds. They became a lesson, not a loss. a reminder that loyalty is the minimum, not the bonus. And the moment you accepted that truth, you never looked at them or anyone like them the same ever again. After you labeled their disloyalty for what it was, you stopped assigning them emotional value. They were no longer someone to protect, impress, or explain yourself to. They became a closed chapter that didn't deserve further analysis. You didn't announce your withdrawal. You didn't threaten to leave. You simply reduced your presence until there was nothing left to take. That quiet exit hit harder than any confrontation because it offered no chance for control. They sensed the shift immediately. The way you spoke changed. The way you listened changed. The way you cared vanished without drama. And that absence of effort told them everything they needed to know. You stopped correcting their behavior. Once you stop correcting someone, it means you've stopped seeing them as part of your future. That's when disloyalty becomes irreversible. They thought loyalty could be negotiated after the fact. But loyalty isn't something you renegotiate, it's something you either honor or lose access to forever. You began treating them like background noise, cordial but distant, polite but unreachable. You didn't owe them hostility, indifference was enough. They tried to revive old memories, old jokes, old emotional leverage. But nostalgia has no power once trust has expired. You don't invest in the past when the future demands better choices. You stopped defending your decision because you didn't need approval. You understood that people who benefited from your loyalty would never support your boundaries. They felt the downgrade instantly. From priority to option, from insider to outsider, from trusted to tolerated, and they couldn't handle how fast it happened. You didn't feel the need to prove you were right. Their behavior kept proving you right on its own. You simply stepped aside and let reality finish the conversation. They mistook your calm for forgiveness. But forgiveness never meant access again. It meant peace for you, not comfort for them. You stopped explaining your standards because you realized people who respect you don't need explanations. Those who don't will argue no matter how clear you are. Disloyalty taught you discernment. It sharpened your instincts. It trained you to notice energy shifts before words change. You evolved because of it. They were shocked by how easily you adjusted to life without them. But once trust is gone, attachment dissolves faster than people expect. You didn't replace them immediately. You replaced the space they occupied with self-respect, and that upgrade made their absence irrelevant. They realized too late that loyalty was the one thing you never compromised on. You could forgive mistakes, flaws, even distance, but not betrayal. You never raised your voice. You never exposed them. You never chased accountability. You let their actions close the door permanently. You stopped wondering what could have been. Once disloyalty enters the picture, what could have been becomes a waste of mental energy. They couldn't accept that you moved on without anger. But anger still cares. Indifference means you've outgrown the situation entirely. You treated the ending like a financial decision, no emotion, no nostalgia, just risk assessment and exit. That mindset protected your future. They are now forced to live with the consequence of being downgraded by someone they underestimated. And that consequence is permanent.